And a very warm welcome. You're in tune to the Art of Living on Cross Rhythms, 96.3 FM, community radio for Plymouth. And this is the program where I genuinely have the privilege of sharing with those men and women who have responsibility for Christian churches and organizations. Today, I'm really excited because I'm interviewing somebody I've known for many years. Reverend Doctor, you must be Reverend Doctor by now, Hugh Osgood, who is a real mover and shaker. And he's actually the previous moderator of the Free Churches in the United Kingdom, plus other stuff. But he's written a book called Is Kindness Killing the Church? And we'll be talking to Hugh about that. But before we start on that, Hugh, as I ask all my guests, can you tell me a little bit about your journey of faith with Christ?
Sure, Chris. It's a privilege to be on the program. Another great question to start with. Well, I grew up in a Christian home, which was really good, but I went through a really skeptical period in my teens, and I didn't know where I was going really. But actually, that skepticism turned to a real seeking God when I went to university, and I was still really skeptical. I mean, they dragged me to Christian Union meetings, and it was a little bit like that, really. And I'd sit there very, very critical, analysing everything. I'd read all the theology books in the local library before I'd gone to university, thinking that would make me look clever. But actually, it just left me confused. So they were praying for me. And, gradually I started really seeking God and taking that seriously, looking at the evidence for the resurrection and those kind of things. But in the end, even when I was intellectually convinced, which I did get to, I knew that it actually had to impact my life. And that was a moment where, I don't know, during the summer at the end of my first year at university, I really knew that God was on my case. I think it was probably because all the Christians I'd been criticizing were praying for me. But during that period, that summer vacation, my first summer back at university, I just ended up really desperate to know God, not just intellectually, but in a personal relationship way. And I did something I thought I'd never do. I went back to my sort of childhood experience of asking Jesus into my heart. And it didn't sound quite right for someone at university to be doing this, but there I was kneeling by my bed saying, look, Lord, just come into my life, make a difference. And I wasn't a great man of faith. I must have prayed that prayer several nights in a row. But then I was coming back from some extra tutoring I was having. I was doing a music diploma as well as doing my degree course. And I just had this moment. I could take you to the very spot where I just knew my life had changed. And I'd got this childhood song running through my head. Things are different now. Something's happened to me since I gave my life to Jesus. Things I loved before have passed away. Things I love much more have come to stay. And I just standing on that pavement down in Brighton and Hove and just knew that as a 17, 18-year-old, I'd just come into a personal relationship with God that was just absolutely transformative. And I've just gone on from there. So that was the start of the journey. I went back to university with a completely different attitude. All those students that have been praying for me wondered what on earth had happened to me. And suddenly why I was the most enthusiastic person rather than the most reluctant person in the Christian Union. And that's where the journey began. And we saw God do lots at university.
And of course, in listening to what you're sharing there, Hugh, there's a combination, isn't there, of head and heart that, God gives us a great ability for knowledge, rationalize these things. And there's never, I think, ever been a separation from knowledge and wisdom. But you're sharing about a personal experience that's hard to quantify. It's simple, but it's profound. It's an issue of the heart where the Bible says all of the issues of life come out of the heart. Is that what happened to you? Was it a spiritual?
Absolutely, Chris. It was really like that. And I couldn't believe it because I was intellectually convinced. I really was. I could have argued the case for Christianity really strongly. But I just knew I needed a heart transformation. And God just turned up in that kind of way, meeting me at my point of need and really just changing everything. So, it is a case of head and heart. But, the heart's got to be right with God. And that's just so important.
Well, it's like C.S. Lewis saying, the most reluctant convert in England, because he was an atheist. And I think, like yourself, was intellectually convinced because it's so powerful, the the claims of Christ and his death and resurrection. Academically, I mean, there's no doubt about it, but people have to open up that heart experience. And although C.S. Lewis was the most reluctant convert in England, you don't sound as if you were that reluctant.
Well, actually, thanks to C.S. Lewis, I'd already been convinced. I'd read Mere Christianity, so I'd got over that particular hurdle, and I became willing rather than reluctant, and God moved. So that was great.
Well, we're going to stop for some music, Hugh, and when we come back, we're just going to touch a little bit about your life in Christendom, because you have been, and I know you very much, you're genuinely a very humble guy, but you've been very influential within Christendom in establishing so many initiatives. So we'll be back with Hugh Osgood right after this. And if you've just tuned in, this is The Art of Living on Cross Rhythms 96.3 FM. Fireside chat with Hugh Osgood, who, as I said before, is a very humble mover and shaker. And Hugh, before we get into some of the stuff that you involved with, you were the moderator for the free churches, and so on November the 11th you would be there laying a wreath at the cenotaph, etc.
Never laying the wreath, but always.
Oh, did you never lay a wreath? Oh, but you were there.
Yeah,
you were there. Yeah. So tell us about that role.
Oh, that's an interesting role, really. Basically, the free churches cover all the denominations that are not Anglican, Catholic, or Orthodox based. So it's a large grouping of churches, and right across the spectrum. So real privilege, and it's normally a 3 or 4 year time of office, but I did two, so 2 in a row. So I got to know the job quite well. It was a real privilege, but it's been great to hand it on, and also to see, because I stepped down just before the Queen died, so my person who took over from me was doing the prayers at the Queen's funeral and also doing part of the blessing at the King's coronation. So quite prominent, really. I was meeting regularly with the Archbishop of Canterbury, Cardinal Archbishop of Westminster, the Orthodox Archbishop, representatives, Pentecostal churches, so on, so that we've got a good overview together. We were all presidents of churches together, so it's good.
And you also involved and instrumental in Churches Together in England.
Yeah, well, that was through that, really. The Free Churches moderator is always automatically one of the presidents of Churches Together in England. So you start off with the pretty wide view with all the denominations, not Anglican, Catholic, Orthodox, and you add in all the rest, and you get the widest view possible of what's going on in the church across the UK. Sort of privilege. Yeah.
Now, Kerry and I have the privilege of seeing you once a year at a gathering of what is called the Pentecostal charismatic assemblies of leaders in the UK, and include charismatic Catholics and I suppose what EPC, evangelical, Pentecostal, everything, yeah, including the Orthodox. And that's an exciting project because it's more of a round table, relationally sharing with each other and just seeing what other.
There's no point senior leaders meeting and just sort of keeping that connectivity to themselves. It's got to happen right the way down, right down to the local situation, right the way through the members of denominations as well as heads of denominations. Yeah, we've got to see that. I think that's really important.
And we're just getting older, Hugh. So what you've done brilliantly is to invite a lot of younger people as well.
Sure. But we've been getting older since the day we were born. So
yeah, that's true. Nothing we can do about it. I still feel 18, so I don't feel particularly old, but in a sense of the process of time. But building with young people is very important. I certainly know that's Kerry and I's thought with Cross Rhythms, contemporary Christian music, out of the Jesus People movement and everything else. And young people have got to make a sense of a world where things have changed dramatically, haven't they, really, in terms of Christendom. And that is really what's inspired you to write this book, which is Kindness Killing the Church? And I've read it, and you've focused really on the communities in the book of Revelation, the 7 churches, and we'll get to the heart of this, of what motivated you to write this book. Small book. I think it's you don't have to be a theologian to understand it. Certainly helps a little bit to have some understanding of the community of church and Christendom. But we'll be back with Hugh right after this music. And if you've just tuned in, welcome to The Art of Living on Cross Rhythms 96.3 FM, community radio for Plymouth. And Fireside Chat with Hugh Osgood, written this great book, Is Kindness Killing the Church? Motivation for the book, Hugh, was what?
Well, a sense of having sort of sat on the top of the pile with the archbishops for 8 years and thinking, I've got to put something into the situation, really, with the experiences I've had. And I reflected on it, and I was thinking, so many church leaders at a senior level had said to me during those 8 years, we need to learn from one another. And when I reflected on that, I realized that I hadn't seen much of that at all. People were sort of reluctantly learning about one another, but even that was reluctant. But learning from one another, where you could actually take things from each other and put it into practice in your own situation, I didn't see a great deal of that. And so I realized that what we've got in the UK, and probably my experience in America and everywhere else, is very much the same. That there are ways in which we are just really polite to each other. Not always polite in some places, but politely sort of disengaging rather than wholeheartedly engaging. So using excuses like, well, I don't want to upset you with my point of view. They weren't like that in New Testament times. If there was a disagreement, they'd thrash it out. Whereas what we tend to do today is just to back away from each other and disengage. So those were the kind of things that were playing on my mind, wanting to get back to some of that energy, that robust unity of the early church. I think we've got people that like unity, and very often what they like is a kind of bland unity. I did hear about one nation where the churches came together organizationally, and someone summed it up, said, well, all the denominations believed so little, there was nothing left to agree on. And I think that we don't want that kind of unity. We want something much more robust than that. So that's what excited me about the possibility.
I know when I read it, I mean, in my own academic research, I've looked into the Pew's Research Organization in America, which is a fairly authentic organization in terms of their research and on religious trends globally. And, 2.4 billion people across the world are traditionally, experientially, culturally aligned to the Christian faith, largest community on the planet. But obviously maybe being aware of younger generation and what they're finding, I call them the Davidic generation, they're looking for relational authenticity, Hugh, which perhaps that generation stoically that got us through the war, being polite was more important sometimes than debating what you were saying, the truth of what we stand on. Not a criticism, but I don't want to offend you because I'm British and we can talk about most things, but let's not get into politics and religion. So in your book, Is Kindness Killing the Church? Are you saying that we can have a form of godliness denying the power, that there isn't the robustness that's required for the living community of Christ throughout the UK to work at the coalface and find the presence of God in a real way?
Yeah, I'm definitely saying that. I think that is true. But I also believe that when you're talking about authenticity, yeah, the younger generation, and I don't really think of them as the younger generation, they're the now generation. I mean, I wrote this book with someone very much looking over my shoulder who was in his 20s at the time. So, that was very helpful. But what I'm aware of is that authenticity is really important. And also, so is giving people space. I mean, we sometimes look back at our generation and felt there was a bit of a disconnect with the generation that went before, that had gone through the war and we hadn't. And we would sort of not necessarily connect. Well, I think, that's also a plus, because in some ways it gave us a huge amount of room because there was a vacuum to fill, and we got on and filled it. And I think there's a lot happening today where people are getting on and doing things. I think we've got a very motivated younger generation that are really pushing things forward. And yeah, I think the biggest thing they need from us is space. I think clamping folk down is not helpful at all. Relational wisdom, if we can share it, yes, but not with the kind of mentoring which is a bit like tormenting rather than mentoring.
Yeah, well, that's something we can cover, that mentoring. I mean, I think for Kerry and I, we think that spiritual mums and dads who don't want to control, who want to encourage, liberate a next generation into whatever God's got for them is very important, because you do it with your natural kids, and you kind of do it with the relationships that you have in your church that look to you for a little bit of perhaps spiritual guidance. But the way that we do that in leadership is quite important. And when you look at Ephesians, the only governance of church really is that family-based construct, isn't it? God puts the broken into families. So we're going to stop for some more music, Hugh. When we come back, I do want to quote a little bit of Justin Welby, who just who's made some comments which I find fascinating, which build into your book. But we'll be back with Hugh right after this. And this is The Art of Living on Cross Rhythms 96.3 FM. Fireside chat with Hugh Osgood, written a lovely book, Is Kindness Killing the Church? I've read it and encouraged by it, Hugh, because, and can I say this, that the statement of Jesus saying we are the way, the truth, and the life, have we defaulted in Jesus is the way, religion, and the life? Because truth is a very important component of our worldview, the existential questions, and the way we live in the day under the microscope of life, isn't it?
Yeah, sure. And I think the church has got to get back to an understanding where truth is a priority. You know, Jesus said, full of grace and truth. Well, I think sometimes we do the grace and don't do the truth. And I think that is a real problem. And that's partly what I was tackling with that idea of kindness. That once you leave the truth out, you're left with something really bland and will in a sense, you know, suffocate the church, really. I don't think it will kill the church, because Jesus said, you know, I will build my church and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. So I know in the end, nothing's going to kill the church, but I do think that some things are holding us up. And I think that kind of bland politeness does hold us up. We need to get back to saying, look, truth matters. And the church needs to actually get some of those conversations, because we're meant to be out there offering solutions to the world. Whereas a lot of the time, what we're doing is absorbing what the world is saying without anything positive back to put in their direction. So there's a lot to do. And that's why I'm really keen to see the churches engaging with each other so that we can actually work things out, come up with being the salt and the light that we're meant to.
And the truth is, it's complex, isn't it? So I visualize Pilate standing before Jesus, who's an absolute truth. He is the absolute truth, saying what is truth. And I say to our folks, well, whatever the truth is to you, you've got to process it truthfully in the light of the absolute truth. But it's not winning an argument that you've got the truth and it works. There's it's much more complex than that, isn't it? It's not just a statement of that's truth and that isn't. It's people have backstories, and their worldview is it's formed out of their environment. And this is in the church. People find Jesus, and then it's the start of finding out who they are, why they got into some of the things that they did. And the church should be the safe environment where we can collectively process that, the backstory. Because when I got saved, I think, Hugh, powerful, I was taught, well, you're saved now, read the Bible, pray, and you'll be okay. And actually, that on one level is true, on another level it isn't, because you've got to outwork your faith. And faith is part of the healing process that God uses to heal us. And it's quite complex.
And there's an isolationism that was in that kind of now you're saved, just read your Bible and pray. I mean, it does, reading your Bible and praying really does help you grow, but actually so does interacting with other people. And, when it says that by this we'll know that we're his disciples, it's because we love one another. That's talking about a robust kind of relationship, not some sort of woolly affection. It's actually something positive. And I think the early church really demonstrated that. And I think where we go wrong today is we're very often saying, oh, well, the church has never really been united. It's because we've got a wrong concept of unity. I think the early church was very much united. It talked about being united in the spirit and going on to a unity of faith. And I think that we need to see there's a foundation of unity which God has given us so that we are one with each other. But in the context of that unity, there's a whole lot of work to do. And we need to be doing it. In order to be salt and light in society, we've actually got to engage with each other, work through some of these big, difficult issues that society is raising. We don't just need to follow society. We need to be there saying, what can we contribute to society so that actually the things that we end up doing show that there's salt and there's light operating in the wider society. So lots of issues around there. And I was aware that many of the things that we should have confronted head on, we've been skirting around. And I think that, we've got to stop skirting around things and be prepared to engage. And we can do that graciously, but I don't want us just to agree to disagree. I think we've got to say that if we're disagreeing, let's press on and see if we can reach a point where we do agree. I know it's a challenge, but it's something that we need to rise to.
And it does speak of people being genuinely secure in their identity and value and purpose in God to engage in that conversation without it being polarized and a battle, because you require a degree of maturity to answer these questions of truth. And
yeah, in the book, I was very much leaning towards the way the 7 churches in Revelation were corrected by Jesus. 5 of them were quite strongly corrected. And when you look at that, it was a case of, look, here's the prescription. If you apply that, there will be a positive prognosis. And I think that we need today to be actually taking those kind of challenges on board. But throughout, every single one of those churches was told, hear what the Spirit is saying to the churches, plural. So in other words, there was a huge expectation on them to listen. And I think perhaps one of the reasons why so many of them had gone off the rails, 5 out of the 7, was because there was a failure to listen to each other. They were making different mistakes, and if they'd listened to each other, they might have been able to bring correctives. But we don't listen enough. I think very often what we do is we go into a discussion with our minds already made up and then trying to push our opinion onto someone else. Whereas if we listen to where they were coming from, we might actually be able to give a more appropriate answer.
Well, let's unpack that a little bit after we have some more music, because it engenders some thoughts, Hugh, that I want to hold on to. We'll be back with Hugh Osgood right after this. And welcome to the Art of Living on Cross Rhythms 96.3 FM, community radio for Plymouth, fireside chat with Hugh Osgood. Just written a book, Is Kindness Killing the Church? And Hugh's been around Christendom, the church, for many years, recently the moderator of the Free Churches. Hugh, when we talk about the early church and the 7 churches in Revelation, but in a way, and this is probably a little bit of a theological statement, the first 300 years of the post-resurrection of the church was a Jewish sect that was becoming Christendom, that was very aware of persecution and realities that sometimes post-Constantine, as we became a global church, nothing wrong with that at all. But in those early days, there was perhaps a balance and an understanding of what faith was about, which sometimes in Christendom, as we try and structure it, we can lose those discussions because, let's face it, in the West, prosperity gospel, consumerism, what's in it for me? And there is a point where God, as our parent, blesses us. Not totally. We do go through trouble, as he says in John 16:33, in this life, you will have trouble. But that early church were the seeds of the martyrs. And today we have a global persecuted church arising, you know, North Korea, China. It's amazing how we're seeing a global church arise that's slightly different than the Christendom that we've experienced.
Yeah, I've always had problems with the Christendom that we've experienced. Anyway, I think that I think that really, when I look at the church in the first century, and let's stick with the first century for a moment, it was very much a people-driven movement. I really think from the day of Pentecost onwards, it wasn't a case of the apostles having to drag everyone else into a discipleship program. I think there was a real desire to go forward. And I think what we've seen in subsequent centuries has been a little bit of control coming in from hierarchical systems. And as that's come in, so it's turned a movement into almost like a monument in some ways. And I think that that's been a tragedy because, you know, what I look for in the church is what we're ultimately going to see. When we see the New Jerusalem, we know that it's got strong walls, it's got open gates, it's got a river of life flowing through it, access to the tree of life there, and transparency and a brightness of God's light in Him being in the midst of it. And I think the church today should be actually emulating that, because that's where we're going to end up. So I would like to see something of that movement that I see in the very first century. I think the persecution may have actually played a part in some places in increasing the control from the top. But I do think as well, there are times when I look at areas that are under persecution today, where the expectation on the individual Christian to rise up and be who they are in Christ comes with that pressure. I know you've just got to watch it, because I know that in those cases too, you can end up with sort of governing structures and so on. And I see that in some of these countries as well. There's always that tendency. Some people see church as a kind of career where their leadership can sort of be a bit oppressive. I think if we could lose that and see that mobilization of people again. I've always had as a motto, maximum mobilization with minimum pressure. That's how I've wanted to see things. And that's how I see the early church functioning, being through the power of the Holy Spirit, stirring people up and making things happen.
We're kind of excited at Cross Rhythms, Hugh, because there's a film that's out now with Kelsey Grammer called The Jesus Revolution.
Yeah, I've seen it. It's absolutely great.
It's brilliant, isn't it? I mean, you talk about messy church.
Yeah, it was messy. It was messy, man.
It was messy.
Really messy.
That I think is a lovely, we use it a lot, messy, because it's not that we're anti-structure, because in many ways, let's play the beautiful game of football, but it's hard to play football without a pitch, referee, or goal. So there needs to be some understanding of orthodoxy, etc. But there's also an understanding which Christ just modeled, that He understands our backstory, and the church should be the place where it's a safe place to share your backstory, and in that love of Christ, in the gifts of the Spirit, find a safe place to get healed. That's church, isn't it, really?
Absolutely. And in many ways, this whole concept of the church being a healing community is reflected in the fact that in Revelation, it says that the leaves of the tree of life are for the healing of the nations. And if you think about that, they get carried to the nations on that river of life. And I think this is where the church needs to really come up and say, hey, look, this is what we can do. We can bring healing to the nation. And we need to do that big time.
So we're coming to the end of the program, Hugh, and I'd like to give a chance when we come back after this next song to, give you a chance to tell people where they can get the book and your website.
Okay.
So sure. we'll be back with Hugh right after this. Well, it's the final part of the Art of Living with Hugh Osgood on his book, Is Kindness Killing the Church? Hugh, just always a joy to meet up and shoot the spiritual breeze. Although we're doing it on radio and social media and stuff, it's wonderful. And I know you share the excitement that even in the good and the bad times, God is always faithful, and a remarkable relationship to build your life on, Jesus. Throughout the centuries, it does what He says on the tin. That was the analogy. But His kindness killing the church. I like it because it's a provocative title, because there's not enough kindness, but that's not what you're saying at all, is it? So do you want to do a little recap and how people can get
Yeah, sure. I just am aware that you know, we need to engage with each other and be prepared to engage robustly. We need to have a desire to find truth together and be able to share that with the world. These are the things that are passions for me. And when I look back at the church right at the beginning and see how Jesus was really concerned that at the end of the first century, the church should enter the second century with that same kind of commitment that it had right at the beginning. And so his corrective letters to the 7 churches weren't really negative. They were saying, look, at the end of the first century, let's make sure the church getting into the second century is full of fire and energy. And I feel like that. I feel in the 21st century, we've got to see the church with that willingness to impact, make a difference in society. So that's the passion. That's why I wrote the book. That's the recap. I'd love you to read it and to say what you think about it. That would be absolutely brilliant. So yeah, that's my plug for the book, Chris.
No, well, I know it's from the heart, Hugh, and that's the main thing. And let me encourage you. I mean, it's a lot. There's not a lot of. It's theologically grounded, but it is very readable, and you don't need a theological degree to read it because it carries within it, as I read it, a lot of relational intelligence, emotional relational intelligence that we need as human beings, and just working through. As Hugh has said, I think in the books, how do you empower at the ground level? And that's really God's humility. He builds from the ground up. He doesn't build from the top down,
No,
which is often the way we abuse authority, isn't it? We expect that, you know, and for all of us, there is one accountability. I just want to end on this, is that the 2 commandments Jesus leaves us, the most important is, first of all, to love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. That's a commitment between you and the Creator, you and your Maker. The second is like it, to love your neighbor as yourself. The key is, it's very hard if you don't know yourself and your own understanding of truth to give to your neighbor. That could be your spouse, your kids. To give them authenticity, you need to at least have some hope in your own truth, committed to the absolute truth that it's working. Hugh, thank you so much for the time.
Am I allowed to say where they can get it?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, you can get it from any good bookshop. You just go in and ask for it. They'll track it down. Obviously, it's there in Christian bookshops. It's on Amazon. It's on Eden. And if you're really stuck, go to my website, hughosgood.com, where there's plenty of other good stuff as well that you can get. So it's Kindness Killing the Church, published by Malcolm Down. You can get it.
Is kindness killing the church? A provocative statement, but it's good to shoot the breeze on these things. Hugh, thanks very much indeed for the time. We'll see you on the journey. God bless.
Bless you too.